Hi, everyone. As Crystal was saying, there is an opportunity for a question and answer at the end of today's formal presentation. So if you do have any questions, there's a GoToWebinar panel on the right side of most of your screens. A section there marked questions is where you can pose any questions to us via text, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. Your microphones are on mute, so don't worry if you're in a noisy environment or your dog barks or your baby cries. No one's able to hear that, so you can rest assured that that's all being private. All right, so let's begin. So my name is Mark Eyre. I'm the Director of Customer Operations here at Brightsquid Secure Communications Corp. And we're putting on today's webinar to talk about compliance requirements primarily for medical offices in Alberta. And there's a lot of information and disinformation and misinformation swirling around on the internet. So I thought today would be a good time to clear up some of the information that you may have heard and provide you with some ideas and options for protecting information within your practice. So we're going to hit on 5 points over the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to try to get this done as quick as I can so you can get back to your regularly scheduled day. But really, there's 5 things we're going to cover. What does compliance mean for those of us in Alberta? Why are these compliance regulations in place? What are the reasons? What's actually required? Sort of what's behind those regulations? What do we actually have to do? What you're protecting and why? And then we'll talk a little bit about what the biggest threat is to your clinic. And that's, I guess, the big bugbear at the end of the conversation is what can really happen if things do go wrong. So to begin with, what does compliance mean? Custodians of data, of patient medical data, are responsible for protecting information. So as the quote on the screen says, custodians are responsible for how everyone that is in your practice handles information. Collect, use, and disclose, often abbreviated as CUD, C-U-D, how you collect, use, and disclose patient information that you have in your practice. You must control that in a very specific way. Now, if we're not careful with patient information, if something does go wrong, what could potentially happen? And the risks are really, there's a lot of them, but bodily harm, humiliation, loss of reputation, things like that are real risks to your patients if we lose control of the information that we store on their behalf. And all of us, not only are we custodians of information, but we're also patients in our own right. I go to doctors, I go to dentists, and I want to make sure that my information is being handled securely. And I know that most people in Alberta, I'm here in Calgary as well, most of us in Calgary and Alberta and Edmonton and places otherwise, all want their information to be handled properly, and they expect it from the custodians to whom they trust their information to. Now, of course, there are downsides to the practice if we don't meet the compliance requirements as laid out by the Alberta government and then the laws of the land. There are potential penalties. Of course, there are fines. Those are always an option. But in bullet number 3 there's talk about some other issues, some other impacts, and fines are the most obvious one. Nobody wants to suffer a financial penalty of $20,000, $200,000. But there's also a concern around reputational damage. I've dealt with a couple of practices in Alberta and abroad that have suffered serious breaches of data. They've lost computers, laptops, thumb drives, and had their information exposed to the world. And the damage to their reputation, in most cases, causes them to lose a significant amount of business or actually go out of business completely. And that's not uncommon. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the later on slides. But also, just if we ignore even the financial penalties and the reputational damage, there's also a thought about business continuity. In a lot of ways, your practice runs on information. Information is your business. And when you no longer have access or control over that information, you're no longer able to provide that high level of service to the people that you're trying to serve. So there's a lot of important reasons to closely hold and guard that information that's put into our hands. Now, what do the actual laws say, and what are the laws that I'm talking about? Primarily, I'm talking about 2 things: the Health Information Act of Alberta and the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, which is more of a federal thing. So I'm going to talk more about the Health Information Act because the acronym is a lot shorter. And the HIA requires a lot of things, but at the bottom there's two statements in bold that I think are the most important for us to talk about today. The first one is that it defines the responsibility of an information custodian to require and develop a privacy impact assessment, a PIA. And that's primarily what brought most of you here today to our conversation. It also talks about mandatory privacy breach reporting. And what that refers to is that if you do suffer a breach of data, if you lose control or someone gets into your information that you don't want there, you're required by law to report that to the Privacy Commissioner. Once that report is made to the Privacy Commissioner, it goes public, and of course, everyone is now that information is available to everyone. And by that information, I mean the information about your practice suffering a breach. Now, this is a relatively new law. I think it was passed in August of this year. And since August, there's been about 40 to 60 breaches reported to the Privacy Commissioner every single week. So these breaches are happening day in, day out. And I'll talk more about the actual method these breaches are happening by, and also ways that we can protect ourselves from being the next potential statistic in that 40 to 60 per week. And now, who does all this information apply to? Who does the Health Information Act apply to? And specifically speaking, it applies to custodians, which are generally, in most cases, dentists or doctors or whoever's in charge of the practice that you're within. Affiliates are going to be the staff members within your practice. That's primarily, office managers, even hygienists, anyone who works within the practice and has access to the patient health information that practice is storing. And then there's also information managers, and information managers is anyone who has access, anyone who's outside of your practice, who through the nature of their relationship has access to your patient health information. Ultimately, it is the custodian who is responsible for the security of all this information. Ultimately, it's the doctor, the dentist who's on the on that responsibility to make sure information is being protected. And then the affiliates and the information managers are acting on behalf of that custodian. So if you're wondering, who's to blame, it's primarily going to be that custodian. Now, the reasons why these regulations are in place, and the reasons why the Privacy Commissioner in Alberta has made these regulations a requirement are for three primary reasons. They're relatively obvious, they're relatively self-explanatory, but let's look at the three primary reasons. One, we need to protect patient information and identity. Our patient's personal private information has value, not only to the patient themselves, but to potential bad guys. I hate to use the word hacker, it's a little too twee for me, but bad guys want to steal information. And it's our job as custodians to protect against that. So that's point number one. Number two, to protect healthcare clinics with the best practice security measures. By protecting our information, we protect not only our patients, but our businesses and our clinics that we're operating. And then finally, to maintain the integrity of the healthcare system. Whether you're a dentist, a chiropractor, or some other practitioner, you're an important part of the health information or the health service and systems in Alberta. And anytime any practice suffers any kind of a breach, the overall strength of Alberta's healthcare system is slightly diminished. So by protecting this information, we're stronger and we can protect breaches and we can keep ourselves protected and healthy. So what is a PIA? PIA, Privacy Impact Assessment, is a document and a process by which we analyze the procedures and policies within your practice and ensure that you have all of the appropriate safeguards in place to protect information. We look at three primary areas within your practice: physical layout, so things like how the doors are locked, how your files are locked up, whether or not patients have visibility to see information on computer screens and things like that. There's administrative controls, things like how you are managing your staff and how you're sort of training them on what security requirements are required. And then, of course, the big one, which is technical. What kind of data protection systems do you have in place to prevent hackers? People think of things like firewalls and encryption, and those are all parts of the PIA. And what the PIA turns out to be is a very large document, generally between 300 to 400 pages in length, that covers all of those areas of your practice and analyzes the things that you're doing to ensure our patient data is being protected. So there's a lot to it. It's a big document, and it requires some expertise to develop that and then submit it to the privacy commissioner, and then have that privacy commissioner accept it so that you have the that stamp of approval to make sure that you're doing everything as expected and as intended and as required. This is a wall of text that I'm not going to read out loud because we do only have 20 minutes. Suffice to say, this is a description of one section of the privacy impact assessment, and there's 5 of these altogether. And there's a lot here to consume and a lot to think about. And you certainly can buckle down and burn the midnight oil and read through all these requirements and develop all the PIA information, but we can certainly help you with that as well. And that's one of the things that I think Crystal's been talking to all of you about in the last couple of days. So what's expected under the privacy requirements, broadly speaking, and this is very boiled down from the previous slide, is that it's important to remember that compliance is not a checkpoint in time where you hit a compliance target and then you never think about it again and the document collects dust in the back room of your office. In order to maintain compliance to the regulations in Alberta, it is expected that it is regularly maintained, updated, and renewed on a regular basis. It's required that staff be trained. I've been to more than one practice, and I won't name names, of course, but I've been more than one practice where staff are hired as receptionists, and they're given no training as to the requirements around what is required with keeping track of patient health information. We need to make sure that we need to be certain that they know what's required. We can't just assume that our new staff members already understand what's in the Health Information Act and what they can and cannot do when they're given access to patient health information. One really common example of this is, it's not necessarily common sense for a staff member to know that if they're dealing with a child's health information and the parents are, let's say they're divorced, what information can be given to the ex-husband or the ex-wife about the patient, the child, whether it's financial information or medical information. There's a lot to consider there. And as I said, it's not a good idea to assume that all of our staff know how to do these things. And the PIA isn't going to change the way that you do business. That last point there is really important. The PIA is intended to look at the way you are doing business, make a couple of tweaks if you have some deficiencies in your security and privacy policies, and then carry on doing things the way that you like to do things. All right. Now, the benefit of doing the PIA and getting things compliant is that we can all rest easy. We can all sleep better at night by understanding and maintaining our information and keeping it secure. Remember that your business is information. Losing control of that information can mean losing control of your business. So by taking the steps, and the steps I'm referring to is the PIA process, we can ensure that we've done everything that we can to protect our practice from those bad guy hackers that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Compliance is good for business for a lot of reasons. We can look at threats that you may not have considered. In a lot of cases, I've talked to practices who just haven't taken the time to think about security. Even just having this conversation that we're having right now, you're probably starting to think about things that may not have crossed your mind in the last weeks or months or years. So just thinking about security is a good way to get started. Ransomware and other bad guy attacks or attacks from bad guy hackers can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and can close your clinic not just for days, but permanently. If you lose control of that data, it can be very difficult or impossible to continue to operate as a practice. Mandatory breach reporting that I mentioned earlier requires that if we do suffer a breach, we are obligated to report that. Patients more and more are getting more tech savvy and more protective of their own information. It seems you don't go a day today or a week without hearing about some massive data breach, whether it's Apple's iCloud or I think recently Home Depot suffered a big breach where a bunch of credit card information was lost. As that information gets into the public sphere, everybody is thinking about what's happening with my information. When I go to the doctor or the dentist or the chiropractor, Am I confident that they're taking the right steps to protect my information? And if they're not, I might just choose to go somewhere else. So a lot of good reasons to ensure your compliance is up to date. Now, I talked a lot about breaches. What actually is a breach? Legally speaking, number one, loss of or unauthorized access to or disclosure of personal information. So that's anything that would be considered personal identifiable information, which a medical practice has plenty of. And is there a risk of harm to the individual if that information is lost? That often refers to things like identity theft. Even just taking your medical information and using it for blackmail purposes. We may not want our private health information to be in the public sphere if that information, is potentially embarrassing. And who's to say what's embarrassing? One of the common comments that I get, especially when dealing with smaller practices, is that, is anyone really trying to steal this X-ray of my patient's teeth? And the fact of the matter is maybe that they're not. But what's important is that that information belongs to the patient, and it's up to the patient to decide what's private. I mean, certainly, someone's HIV status or mental health history, we would all agree that that's very secret and private stuff that should be kept as such. But so too is an X-ray of a hand, a foot, a mouth, or whatever, depending on the patient's point of view. So that's to say all information is private, and all information should be protected to the same level and the same degree. If we don't report a breach, it is an offense to knowingly contravene those regulations. And those violations can cost up to $100,000. That's, of course, the top level fine, but you can be certain that if there is a breach and it goes unreported, the custodian is going to be the one responsible for explaining to the commissioner what went wrong, and fines are almost a certainty. And where are these breaches and what's causing all these breaches is something you've probably heard in the news talked about quite a bit lately, and that's talking about ransomware. Broadly speaking, ransomware is a form of extortion where a bad guy puts software on your computer that locks up information on your computer or on your network within your practice. And then once that information is locked up, you can no longer access your patient's health information, whether that's on your EMR, your dental practice management system. You can no longer get to that data. You can imagine how difficult it is to continue to operate your business if you can't get to your data. So they charge you a fee to give you information back to give you access back to your own information. And that fee is paid through Bitcoin, and there's a lot of technicalities in there. But long story short, it's either pay me or I'm keeping your information. Or if you don't pay me by Thursday, I'll delete or disseminate your information to the public. So all that to say is ransomware is a nasty, terrible thing that these bad guys are using, and they're using it to make money. It's a $1 billion industry. Estimates are as high as $5 billion were earned by these ransomware hackers last year. And these messages, these ransomware attacks are going out by the billions. They're attacking over and over and over again. And it's just a matter of time until they find someone who's vulnerable, who hasn't taken the appropriate steps to protect their information. And the way ransomware gets into your office is through, almost always, it's going to come in through email. 92% of malware that gets into offices comes in through email. So it's expensive, it's costly, and it's dangerous to your practice. And there's ways to protect yourself, and one of them is through the Brightsquid secure mail service, which I'll only talk about a tiny bit today. So I see by the clock that I'm kind of getting close to my end of time, so I'm going to speed up the pace here a little bit and talk about a couple of really common misconceptions that I hear when I talk to a lot of practices. One is that my IT department has done things to protect my practice, and I'm sure that they have. I've worked with a number of IT providers from Stony Plain to Lethbridge, and all of them understand the requirements of firewalls and so on. But security of your information does not equal compliance. In order to be compliant, you have to go through the particular PIA steps to reach that compliance target. And in most cases, the IT department isn't the one doing the privacy impact assessment. It's someone else. We can't assume that staff know what they're doing. Privacy compliance is not common sense. It requires formal training and a formal setting to make sure that we're in the right frame of mind. Are Alberta clinics a target? It doesn't matter. The thing about ransomware, like I was saying a couple of slides ago, is that ransomware is not a targeted activity. No one is sitting, behind their computer in some foreign country, deliberately looking for a practice in Stony Plain, Alberta. They are sending out these attacks by the millions and the billions, and they're just sending them to email addresses, hoping for someone to click on the link and expose their practice so they can charge them to get it back. Another big issue is that a lot of thoughts are that no one is looking, no one is monitoring this information. With mandatory breach reporting being in place and patients having the opportunity to complain directly to the Privacy Commissioner, there doesn't need to be a monitoring system. If there's a problem, it'll be exposed, and that's where the problems start. The risk is very large. Ransomware attacks can cost tens of thousands of dollars. If you search, the local news here in Calgary or Edmonton or Lethbridge, you will find all kinds of practices and large institutions that have suffered ransomware attacks that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And the insidious thing about ransomware is even if you pay that fine, you're not in the clear. There's a very good chance that even after paying the money, you won't get your data back. And even after paying your money, you don't know what happened to your data. You're then required to report that as a broad, wide-scale data breach. And that's where, of course, mandatory breach reporting comes into play again. Developing a PIA is difficult and expensive. That's actually kind of true. It does require a lot of expertise to develop a PIA. It's a big document like I talked about before. We here at Brightsquid do them all the time. We've done literally thousands of them, and we can make it a lot easier for your practice. So that brings me to our privacy services bundle that we've been talking about for the last couple of months. This is a bundle of services that we here at Brightsquid at the Calgary office can help you develop for your practice. So we will develop your privacy impact assessment and get it submitted to the OIPC, which stands for the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner, and ensure that we get you to an accepted state. We'll assist with all the supporting documentation that goes with that PIA. That's referring to the information manager agreements and vendor non-disclosure agreements, all things that are required under the privacy impact assessment. We know the format that the commissioner is looking for, and we can assist you in maintaining and updating your PIA as required. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the PIA or the privacy compliance is an ongoing process. As your practice grows and changes, as you add new doctors and new staff, you're required to keep it up to date, and we can help with that as well. We also provide training for medical office staff. We do training sessions in the major centers, Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, Red Deer, multiple times a year. The last one we had nearly 200 attendees, and everyone comes in. We have 3 hours of presentation from our privacy experts, and we can make sure everyone understands the basics of what they need. And we provide that a couple of times a year in those locations. We provide access to our secure mail system. So if you need secure mail, well, you do need a system like secure mail to share patient information inside of your practice, and we include that in the bundle. We assist with breach management assistance. So if you do suffer a breach, we're here to help. We've got a privacy expert hotline that's available to you at the Calgary office. So if you ever have a question about, is it okay to do this, or what should I do in this situation, call us and we can help you with that. And we can also provide you with cyber insurance. I'm sure all of you have liability and practice insurance for your offices. We can help you get set up with cyber insurance so that if you do suffer a specific cyber attack like ransomware or social engineering or any one of 1,000 other types of attacks that can happen to your data, we can provide you with coverage up to $500,000 to help pay for the specific costs associated with those kinds of attacks. And now, as we're getting close to the end of the conversation, I'll remind you that if you have any questions, you can please submit them to the right-hand side, and I'll have Crystal show those to me or read those out when we get to the end of this last slide that I'm on here now. So if you want to talk in more information and contact us for getting set up with a PIA, our phone number is there on the screen, as is our email address. And of course, you can reach us at the website there, albertapia.ca. Our privacy services that I talked about is normally $5,350 for your practice. Right now, for a limited time, there's a discount code available through a partnership with the Alberta Dental Association and College to get 44% off that price, bringing it down to just under $3,000. So with that, Crystal, if you're still on the line with me, if you want to open your mic up, are there any questions in the queue that we can address in the next, let's say 2.5 minutes?
I have a question here. I have a question. I heard from a friend that dentists don't need a full-blown PIA. We only need to do a Netcare PIA to be covered. Is that true?
Yes, I've heard that as well. So I've heard that rumor, and no, it's not true. The fact of the matter is, it's the um, it's the Privacy Commissioner of Alberta, the Health Information Act, that requires that this full-blown PIA be done. The Netcare PIA is actually a small portion. Well, not small. The Netcare PIA is a part of the full-blown PIA that you're required to have in order to meet the compliance requirements of the Health Information Act. That Netcare PIA that's being referred to is what's required for your practice to get access to Netcare. So you need to have both, and the one small component doesn't really protect you or meet the compliance requirements that the Information Act lays out. And I think we have time for one more quick question, Crystal.
Okay. We use the CDA system to send X-rays. Do we have to switch to your Brightsquid system?
No, you don't have to. Of course, I'm biased, and I would recommend that you do use Brightsquid Secure Mail. It's a quick and easy way to share information with anyone you choose, doctors, labs, patients themselves. But the CDA Secure Mail system is also accepted for use by the Privacy Commissioner. So if you're using that, by all means, continue to use it. And the thing about whatever systems you're using, those are what the things that we need to put into your PIA and declare, here is what I do to protect information. So whether you're using this practice management system or that one, or this secure mail system or the CDA one, those are all the things that go into the PIA that make up your compliance structure. And I see there's one last question that just popped in as I was talking right now, and it's actually more of a comment that someone said, once you've paid the ransom for ransomware, the bad guys still have your information. So even if they've given you a copy of it back, it doesn't mean that those bad guys don't still have it. So there's a lot, ransomware again is an insidious, awful thing. It's so important that we protect our patients' health information because of a lot of different reasons. Because patients expect it, patients require it, it helps protect our business, and it helps protect the Alberta health information system as a whole. So thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time out of your day to listen. And I hope that you have some more information now than you had earlier. And you can always follow up with us later on today or tomorrow or next week if you have any additional questions.